Lecture 10. Listen to part of a lecture given in an American literature class.
San Francisco, America's romantic city by the bay, has always been a haven for the artists, writers, and lovers who have left at least part of their hearts there. One of the great American romantics who wrote in San Francisco was Jack Kerouac. Kerouac rewrote the history of an entire post-war generation of youth, forcing them out of their post-war confines and leading them out on the road. Born on March 12, 1922, in Lowell, Massachusetts, to a working-class Catholic French-Canadian family, Kerouac had a typically all-American childhood. He played sandlot baseball, read Pulp Fiction, and became a high school football star. He entered Columbia University on a football scholarship, but when a leg injury put him out of action on the gridiron, he chose the literary field of work. American literature would never be the same. His romanticized autobiographical novels and wayward travels, which were often the basis of his work, made him the unquestioned king of the Beat Generation writers. Before becoming the father of the San Francisco-based Beat Generation, Kerouac was writing in the bars and basement apartments of New York City's Lower East and Lower West Sides. Here, he met and worked with William S. Burroughs and Allen Ginsberg before they all took their restless spirits west and started a literary and cultural revolution. Kerouac first landed in the San Francisco Bay Area in 1947, hoping to get a berth on a merchant marine ship. Here, he soon met his kindred spirit, Neal Cassady, whose frenetic letters and cross-country travels spurred Jack to write his preeminent work, On the Road, in one long paragraph during the month of April 1951. Since the book was written as a simple personal testament in search of his writing soul, Kerouac had no idea that On the Road would spur a generation onto the highways and into the tumultuous activism of the Vietnam era a decade later.
Lecture 11. Listen to part of a lecture on jazz given in a music history and appreciation class.
So, today, let's continue our discussion on the history of jazz music in the 20th century. For a jazz musician in New York City in the early 1940s, the most interesting place to spend the hours between midnight and dawn was probably a Harlem nightclub called Minton's. After finishing their jobs at other clubs, young musicians like Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Kenny Clarke, and Thelonious Monk would gather at Minton's and play jam sessions, informal performances featuring lengthy group and solo improvisations. The all-night sessions resulted in the birth of modern jazz. Working together, these African-American artists forged a new sound, known as bebop. Unlike swing, the enormously popular jazz played in the 1930s, bebop was not dance music. It was often blindingly fast, incorporating tricky, irregular rhythms and discordant sounds that jazz audiences had never heard before. Earlier jazz, like practically all of Western music up to that time, used an 8-note scale. Bebop, in contrast, was based on a 12-note scale, thereby opening up vast new harmonic opportunities for musicians. The musicians who pioneered bebop shared two common elements: a vision of the new music's possibilities and astonishing improvisational skill, the ability to play or compose a musical line on the spur of the moment. Improvisation within the context of a group setting is, after all, the essence of jazz, which has been described as the musical experience of the passing moment. Like many revolutions, unfortunately, the bebop movement encountered heavy resistance. Opposition came from older jazz musicians originally, but later and more lastingly from a general public alienated by the music's complexity. Furthermore, due to the government ban on recording that was in effect during the early years of World War II, the creative ferment that first produced bebop remains largely undocumented.
Lecture 12. Listen to part of a lecture in an American history class.
Today we'll talk a bit about the myth of Betsy Ross. Elizabeth Betsy Ross, who lived from 1752 to 1836, was a Philadelphia seamstress. According to legend, Betsy Ross was a designer of the first American flag, the Stars and Stripes, a rectangle of red and white stripes with a circle of stars in one corner. The legend of her role began in 1870 when her grandson William J. Canby presented a paper about Ross at a meeting of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. According to Canby's paper, General George Washington visited Ross's home frequently, and Ross sewed clothes for him. One day, George Washington came to her house and asked that she design a flag for the soon-to-be independent American nation. Ross made alterations to the rough sketch that Washington gave her and created the first American flag. Canby's story has become a part of American folklore, but there are doubts about its accuracy. To begin with, his story was recorded 94 years after the events it describes and was told to him when he was a small boy. Canby says Ross and Washington's meeting took place in June of 1776, but historians have found no mention of meetings about a flag in government records or in Washington's personal diaries and writings. Finally, Canby asserted that the Betsy Ross flag was in use soon after the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776, but Congress did not officially adopt national colors until 1777. Ross may not have designed the Stars and Stripes, but she definitely made flags of some kind for the new American state. The minutes of the State Navy Board of Pennsylvania for May 29, 1777, refer to an order on William Webb to Elizabeth Ross for 14 pounds 12 shillings and 2 pence for making ships' colors.
Vocabulary practice. Now, listen to some vocabulary words taken from the previous talks. Listen to each word as it is pronounced, and repeat it after the speaker. Then listen to the definition and an example sentence that you heard in the talk.
Number 11. Lexicon. Definition. Word list or dictionary. Example. Whether this was said in jest or not, it is a term that has stuck and is now a part of the lexicon of modern American culture.
Number 12. Wayward. Definition. Going the opposite of what is expected. Rebellious. Example. His romanticized autobiographical novels and wayward travels, which were often the basis of his work, made him the unquestioned king of the Beat Generation writers. Number 13. Preeminent. Definition. Unsurpassed, most excellent. Example. Here, he soon met his kindred spirit, Neil Cassidy, whose frenetic letters and cross-country travels spurred Jack to write his preeminent work, On the Road, in one long paragraph during the month of April 1951.
Number 14. Discordant. Definition. Inharmonious, blending in a harsh way. Example. It was often blindingly fast, incorporating tricky, irregular rhythms and discordant sounds that jazz audiences had never heard before.
Number 15. Accuracy. Definition. Correctness or precision. Example. Canby's story has become a part of American folklore, but there are doubts about its accuracy.
Now you will hear a series of academic lectures on various topics in the biological sciences. The biological sciences include fields such as general biology, physiology, anatomy, pathology, marine biology, zoology, ecology, and health sciences. These talks are similar to what you might hear in a lecture at a university, on a radio broadcast, or in an educational program on television. You may want to replay these tracks and take notes on any words that you don't understand. After every 4 talks, you will hear 5 vocabulary words taken from those talks, with definitions and sample sentences from the talks.